This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Nerds. I'm back at home, recording in the comfort of my green room, and we're in week 2 of the NFL preseason. Now, as I've said before, you want to wait as long as you can to have your fantasy drafts. But right around now is when I start to feel that it's actually acceptable if you want to have your drafts. If everybody can't get on the same page, around week 2 into week 3 of the NFL preseason is when that should be the absolute beginning of your drafts. I don't want to see drafts before. I don't want to hear that anybody's drafted before the preseason has even started. So we're finally into draft season. So if you have any questions, you can give them to me on Twitter at Jarvi the King, and I will do everything in my possibility to get back to you as soon as possible. But let's get into some NFL news. Now, there's obviously going to be there's a ton of injury news, and I could sit here and tell you all the different hamstrings and groin injuries the players are going through. But the best way for you to find out is to just go online, look at your apps. Hopefully you've downloaded the FanUp Network app, because that's a great place where you can find all your fantasy news and information, especially injury news. But I'm not going to sit here and go through all the injuries. I'll list a couple that I think are that are more important than others. But for all the general injury news, I suggest you guys to go out there and to make sure that when you're drafting, that you're not drafting somebody who's going to be out for an extended period of time. So I'm going to start the news with the Chicago Bears. Alshon Jeffrey, he came up big in the second exhibition game. He had 2 targets, 2 catches for 41 yards against the Patriots. Now, that's not a gigantic stat total, but what it is it's proof that the hamstring injury that he was dealing with doesn't seem like it's going to be too much of an issue, which I think that's a burden off of drafters who have already gone through their drafts and they spent a high draft pick on Alshon Jeffrey. So unless something pops up in the next couple of weeks, I wouldn't worry about drafting Alshon Jeffrey at all. Sticking with the Chicago Bears, there was some possibility that there was a running back position battle, that Jeremy Langford didn't really have that starting spot locked up. There was rumors that rookie Jordan Howard and even maybe Kadeem Carey might be pushing him for the number 1 spot and to get more touches once the season rolls around. But from what it looks like in the preseason, is that Jeremy Langford really is solidifying himself as the number 1 guy. So going into drafts, you still may want to look at maybe drafting one of those guys as a handcuff late. If you have a roster spot, maybe put Jordan Howard, because you have with Jeremy Langford, he is a bell cow running back. You have Jaquiz Rodgers on there, who he's more of a pass-catching threat. And Kadeem Carey, I would also put him in that boat. But Jordan Howard is the only other running back really on the Bears that is a big bruising back and could do some damage on the goal line. So if you go out and draft Jeremy Langford, I would suggest maybe drafting Jordan Howard late in your draft. He probably shouldn't be. I'm probably not going to draft him. If I don't have Langford, I would let him sit there and then let him sit on the waiver wire. But if you do have a roster spot, and if you get afforded that luxury and you don't need another wide receiver or another backup quarterback, give a chance to Jordan Howard. He may surprise some people. Moving on to the Cincinnati Bengals. Brandon LaFell was out. He's the number 2 wide receiver right now. And Brandon Tate was looked at as being the number 3 wide receiver guy, but they gave the nod in preseason game number 2 to rookie Tyler Boyd, who I've mentioned And I think Tyler Boyd has the possibility to move up and be that number 3 slot wide receiver. He may even threaten to be the number 2 wide receiver on that team. LaFell hasn't really done a whole lot in the last couple of years. Brandon Tate doesn't wow you. So I think Tyler Boyd, he is going to try to make a name for himself. And definitely, he was going up against the Lions, but he had 2 catches for 38 yards and a pretty decent touchdown. He did look a little bit wide open on that play, but it's something to watch. And if you're going to draft Bengal wide receivers, you really should look at Tyler Boyd. I think Brandon Tate, LaFell, Tyler Boyd, it's a toss-up. It's going to be AJ Green and Tyler Eifert, and then even the running backs, Jeremy Hill and Giovanni Bernard, and then it's going to be everybody else. But take a look at that. In that same preseason game, Lions tight end Eric Ebron, he's still not practicing. He did not participate in the preseason game, which it's starting to get a little concerning. For me as a Lions fan, I really do believe that this season's success part of it's gonna rely on the development of Eric Ebron. So it's something he's not walking around in a boot, which that's good to see. They're saying that he is working out in some capacity, but you'd really want to see him come back and start practicing and maybe even show up maybe in the 3rd preseason game, whether it's only for 1 series or a couple series. You want to get that confidence that he's going to be healthy and ready for week 1, but it may just end up that he's not going to play the rest of the preseason, and it's going to be a toss-up week 1 if Ebron's going to be ready or not. So I would be careful drafting him in the draft. He's likely at the bottom end of the top 10. I'd even probably scoot him out of the top 10 at this point, because there's other guys who are already, they're playing and they're going to produce come week 1. Sticking with the Detroit Lions, Marvin Jones, the free agent pickup to come in and try and help fill the void that was left when Calvin Johnson retired. He is looking like a really good wide receiver. It's weird. He played the Bengals in the preseason, and he came from the Bengals. He was really looked at as kind of just a deep threat, and they have been saying that he does have injury issues, but he really has shown that he does have some skills as a wide receiver, and I'm starting to see maybe what Bob Quinn saw when they made him their top priority in free agency. And in both of the preseason games, he's made really, really acrobatic catches right on the sideline, which that's going to be good, because if anybody knows Matt Stafford, he throws for a ton of yards, but he isn't super, super accurate, and he can be erratic at times. So if we get a wide receiver who can go out there and get jump balls and just get yards for us, Marvin Jones could actually be productive in fantasy. We've seen what Calvin Johnson has done for fantasy players. Golden Tate, the year that Calvin Johnson was hurt, had a really good fantasy season. So it'll be Marvin Jones. I might actually start moving him up in my draft boards. I'm not drafting him super, super high. I'm not sure if I'm going to say that he's ready to be a starter for my fantasy team, but I think he's going to provide some really good depth for anybody who drafts him. And one more, I promise this is my last Lion update, but it is important, because running back Amir Abdullah he's slated to be the number 1 running back on the team, and he has shown flashes of being a really good running back, but he didn't get to the preseason game. And he's working out in a limited basis at training camp, and it's really leaning towards we're not going to see him until the regular season starts. It does give me some concern as a Lions fan, as a fantasy owner. When I'm drafting, I'm trying to minimize risk as much as possible, and when I see that a guy isn't a full participant in training camp, he isn't playing in preseason games, and the team isn't giving me a definite saying, we're just being precautious, we want to keep him out, we want him ready for week 1. that does give me a little bit of, it makes me a little concerned. So I might drop him down in my drafts a little bit because if I'm drafting a guy to be my running back 2 or maybe my number 1 backup at running back, I want to make sure that I'm going to have him because, come the bye week, if Amir Abdullah isn't ready to go, I have to go onto the waiver wire and hope that somebody is panning out and can fill me in for that week. So moving on from the Lions, I know. Going on to the Philadelphia Eagles, the past week they traded for Tennessee Titans wide receiver Dorial Green-Beckham, which it was a little surprising because we've talked about him on this podcast a little bit before. Going into last year with the Tennessee Titans, he was a raw product. And going into this year, I thought he was going to be a big part of that Titans offense. But there were rumors out of Titans camp that they still didn't think he was progressing hard enough, that he wasn't working hard enough. So they traded him to the Philadelphia Eagles. And that wide receiver situation just seems to be a mess. Jordan Matthews is still going to get his, but everybody else, Nelson Aguilar, Josh Huff, and now you throw Dorial Green-Beckham in there. It says something about all those other wide receivers. And you wouldn't have thought that he was traded there this week that he'd actually play in their preseason game. But they threw him out there, which he can't have learned too much of the playbook because, he was targeted twice. He didn't catch either of those balls. And this could be bad news for Dorial Green-Beckham. One, because it says something about the Titans not liking his work ethic. And that could be the main downfall for this wide receiver, even though he has such high potential. If he doesn't have the work ethic to be in the NFL, he may be out within the next couple of years. But it's also saying something else about the rest of the Eagles wide receivers that they went and traded for this guy, that they clearly don't like what they have on their team. So that's going to be something to watch through the rest of the preseason and even going into the regular season. For Dorial Green-Beckham, it's going to I'd take very high precaution drafting him because you're just not sure how the Eagles are going to use him and how quickly he can learn this new system. And I mean, hopefully, the best case scenario is that he can pick it up quick and they can actually use him in games. But a realistic scenario that I'm seeing is that it's going to take him probably a good 4 to 6 weeks to really start to grasp the offense. And by that time, you're midway through your fantasy season. So I'm not sure how much he's going to help you in your season this year. Going on to the Carolina Panthers, Devin Funchess is impressing a lot of people at training camp. Now, last year, Kelvin Benjamin was out, and everyone thought it was just donezo for the Carolina Panthers, and Cam Newton proved everybody wrong. He was able to take a group of wide receivers that consisted of Ted Ginn, Corey Philly Brown, and Devin Funchess, and they turned it into a team that made it to the Super Bowl. Now they get Kelvin Benjamin back, and Devin Funchess has really proven that he can be a number 2 threat. He may even be on a team with less wide receivers. He could be a number 1 receiving option. Living in Michigan, I saw him play at U of M. And he was definitely impressive, but that was going up against college players. And I think it really showed in the beginning of last year that there was that transition period that you see a lot of rookie wide receivers go through. But you see he had 5 touchdowns over the last 9 games. It definitely helped that Cam Newton kind of went berserk the last part of the season. But Devin Funchess could be an interesting player this season. I'm not sure if I'm moving him up too high on my draft boards. I think I feel comfortable drafting him where his ADP is. But if you are desperate for wide receiver help, Devin Funchess could be a guy who could bail some people out. Sticking in the NFC South, another wide receiver that is impressing some people, Aldrick Robinson, the Atlanta Falcons. I really think they're trying to figure out who's going to be that number 2 wide receiver opposite of Julio Jones. For the longest time, it was Roddy White. But he had a down year last year. He's getting older. It's what happens. So now it's really kind of up for grabs there. And Aldrick Robinson, it's going to be a battle between him and Justin Hardy and Mohamed Sanu. And I probably look at him more. He's probably going to be the last guy out. He's going to be that 4th wide receiver. But he's probably going to surprise some people at some point in the season because it's just the way the NFL happens. He's going to have a game where he's going to have 5 catches and 120 yards and a touchdown or 2. It's going to be trying to decipher if Aldrick Robinson can actually produce week in, week out, which unfortunately I don't think he's going to, even though everybody's saying that he's impressing people at training camp. So Aldrick Robinson, I'd leave him alone until later in the draft. Going over to the West Coast, the Seahawks are saying Jimmy Graham might not be ready for week 1, which would kill one of my King's decrees. And slowly but surely, I'm seeing a lot of those crumble. But I still have hope for a lot of them. What they're saying is he returned to practice last week, but there's really no timetable for his full return. So I think what that means, you're probably not going to see him in the preseason. And unless you get a definite confirmation from head coach Pete Carroll, Jimmy Graham might not see week 1. And I really wouldn't be surprised if he sits out the first couple weeks because I think they have a lot of money invested in him, and they would rather him be healthy for a playoff run rather than trot him out week 1 just so they can get him out there. So they're gonna take the very cautious approach with Jimmy Graham. So be careful drafting him when you're going for tight ends. Maybe go for the guy after him. Maybe look at a Julius Thomas. Maybe look at a Zach Ertz or somebody else behind him before taking Jimmy Graham. I still really like him, and if he's healthy, I think he's going to be a great tight end. But you also have to factor in that he is injury prone. Without this injury, he is still injury prone, and you're not sure what you're going to get. And the last bit of news I have, it's a little surprising. I talked about him a little bit last week, and that's Terrell Pryor. With all the issues that the Browns are having at receiver right now with Josh Gordon, he's going to be out the first 4 games, we'll see if he can stay off the weed long enough to actually play in an NFL game. Then Corey Coleman, the number 1 wide receiver that they picked in the draft, he's been out with a hamstring injury. Andrew Hawkins also out with a hamstring injury. Terrell Pryor has been getting some play in training camp, and we saw in the Browns preseason game caught a 50-yard touchdown pass from RG3, which I think that kind of blows everybody away. I think Terrell Pryor he's basically just left on the side of the road for the past couple seasons, and everyone has really discounted him. And he might actually get a chance to prove himself this year with the Cleveland Browns. And I mean, definitely with Josh Gordon out for the first couple weeks, even if Corey Coleman does play, I think from what he's done in training camp and what we've seen now in preseason games, Terrell Pryor really is making a case for being a starting wide receiver. What's he actually going to do for you fantasy-wise will be the question. I'm not saying go out and draft Terrell Pryor in your second and third round of your draft, but maybe midway through the draft, if Terrell Pryor's still there, he might be an interesting option. And I think his biggest value will be the first couple weeks, and that will be the decision you have to make. If you have a guy who's going to be or who is injury prone, it's going to be the issue is starting Terrell Pryor over one of your bigger guys, and maybe if you have a matchup where Terrell Pryor just fits better than your other wide receiver, maybe you start him. But the biggest value you're going to get out of him is going to be those first 4 weeks of the season. But after that, I'm not sure I can trust Terrell Pryor as far as I could actually throw him, which is not very far. But that does it for NFL news. We're going to take a quick break. When I come back, I'm going to talk to you about quarterbacks. I think that's one of the biggest issues in the draft is where to really start drafting your quarterbacks. And I'm going to give you the spot where I think you should really start looking at drafting your quarterbacks. You're listening to the Fantasy Nerd Show on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerd Show on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. Big thanks to the Fan Up Network for sponsoring this show. And I want to talk about quarterbacks right now. And I think that's probably one of the biggest debates in drafts is where to really draft a quarterback. Going back, I think you always started seeing quarterbacks go in the first and second round. But as the league has progressed and as scoring systems have changed, unless it's a league that really gives points to the quarterbacks, you really should start to wait on quarterbacks because you should get more depth at running back and wide receiver and wait on those high-end quarterbacks. And as also what we've seen is that there isn't a lot of difference between, you have your top-tier quarterbacks, your Cam Newton, your Aaron Rodgers, your Andrew Luck. And then after that, it narrows. There's not a lot of difference between guys like Carson Palmer and Phillip Rivers. They're pretty much interchangeable quarterbacks. So the question really is when should you start looking at drafting your quarterback for your fantasy team? Because it definitely hurts if you miss out on getting a top 10 quarterback. It can really change your team. Now, if you get one of those top quarterbacks, unless there is a catastrophic injury like we saw last year with Andrew Luck, they are going to help you. They're going to help and they're going to carry your team. But you want to try and balance that out. You want to get a pretty good running back, but then it helps to have a ton of depth at running back and wide receiver because those are the positions that they do fluctuate, and you're not sure what you're going to get week in and week out. So I did a bunch of mock drafts. I looked at the average draft positions for quarterbacks, and I saw a pretty good trend as to where quarterbacks were drafted. In a bunch of mock drafts, I saw the majority of the top 10 quarterbacks going between the 3rd and the 7th round. Now, I'm not saying that you have to follow this religiously. This is the information that I'm giving you to help you try to make that decision of where you want to take this quarterback. In the 3rd and 4th round, you had your top 4 quarterbacks go, the Cam Newton, Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck, and Russell Wilson. And then later between the 6th and 7th round is when all those other bottom end quarterbacks started getting taken. So it begs to differ. Where should you really? What's the perfect place to start looking to draft my quarterback? And for me, it may sound easy, but I'm going to split the difference. I think the 5th round is really where you want to start looking at drafting your quarterback. So you'll have 4 rounds already. Hopefully you take the best player available. Now, maybe it's 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers. Maybe it's 3 wide receivers, 1 running back. Maybe it's 3 running backs, 1 wide receiver. Who knows? Maybe you got Rob Gronkowski and then you have 2 wide receivers and a running back. Whatever mix of players you have. But the 5th round, that's where I kind of see that's the best place to start looking. The 5th quarterback that I've been seeing taken is Drew Brees, and he's somewhere at the beginning middle of the 5th round and into the 6th round. So if you're start looking at the 5th round, I think what you want to look at is the running backs and wide receivers that are there, the running backs and wide receivers that you already have, And if you can really upgrade your running backs and wide receivers with the player that you can take, I would take another running back and wide receiver. But if you already have stacked positions, why not go after one of those elite quarterbacks in the 5th round? You're probably not going to get one of those top 4 guys, but maybe they've fallen. So at the 5th round, maybe you catch a break, and Russell Wilson is sitting there in the 5th round. That could really change your fantasy season, because now you have 4 depth players, and maybe they're probably going to be starters for you, a running back and wide receiver, and then you get your starting quarterback. And Russell Wilson is going to be I think he's going to be a stud this year. But then if he's already gone, you get your pick of the litter between Drew Brees, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, Carson Palmer. Maybe if you even want to slide up a little far and take Tom Brady. Brady comes with the asterisk that you're going to have to find somebody for those first 4 games. But the 5th round is really where it's a good spot to take a quarterback, and that's just my opinion. And I think if you start sliding a little bit and looking at the ADPs for all these quarterbacks, all those top guys, those are drafted probably where they should be drafted. But then when you start getting down to Carson Palmer, Blake Bortles, Tom Brady, and Eli Manning, their ADPs are lower. So if you're drafting them in the 7th round, you're not getting the correct value for them. So 5th round is where you want to look for those the middle of the top tier of quarterbacks. Now I'm going to end this episode a little bit early because I want to come back next week. It'll be week 3 of the preseason, and that's where we really start to see what teams are going to actually be playing. We're going to actually have a better idea of the depth charts of most teams. And hopefully I can get my brother back on and have a conversation with him and really start diving into drafts and what really should we be what should we be looking at, and then really getting ramped up for the beginning of the season. But I can't leave you without giving you my King's Decree. My King's Decree this week is that New Orleans Saints' Mark Ingram will be a top 5 running back this year. And as always, this may blow up in my face, but I'm going out on a limb here. And I'm looking at the stats, and currently he's viewed as just being kind of on the outside of the top 10 of running backs. He's usually being drafted somewhere late in 2nd rounds, early in 3rd rounds. But if he can stay healthy, I really do think that he has what it takes and the ability to be a top 5 fantasy running back. You saw last year he started putting it together, and he was becoming more of a receiving threat. He caught 50 balls after only catching 53 in his first 4 seasons, and he did that all in just 12 games. The linchpin of this decree, though, is if he can stay healthy, which unfortunately he doesn't have a really great track record. He's posted seasons of 10 games, 16 games, 11, 13, and 12 through his first 5 seasons. But he's only 26. He's got that going for him. He's not a super old running back. He's really in the prime of his career. And unless CJ Spiller is going to cut into the receptions that he gets, which I think CJ Spiller is kind of like Reggie Bush 2.0. He's going to be hurt at some point in the season. Mark Ingram is really poised for a breakout season, and that's why he is my King's Decree. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Nerd Show. We'll be back next week. We'll have more news, more discussion, and until then, later, nerds.